Hello, you're watching A News. I'm Dilek Tuna. Here are the top stories. US President Donald Trump terminates all trade talks with Canada. A Russian attack kills 2 and injures 14 in Ukraine's Odessa. Lithuania quits global landmine ban, citing Russia's threat. US President Donald Trump has issued a strong response to Canada's planned digital tax. He announced the immediate suspension of trade talks between the two countries and said new tariffs on Canadian goods would be introduced in the coming days.
US President Donald Trump announced on Friday that he is immediately suspending trade talks with Canada over its planned digital tax targeting American technology companies. He called the tax a direct attack on his country and said new tariffs on Canadian goods would be announced next week. Canada's planned 3% digital services tax would apply retroactively from 2022 to companies such as Amazon, Meta, Google and Apple. Trump's decision casts doubt on the agreement reached during the G7 summit, where both sides had pledged to finalise a deal within 30 days.
No, they put a tax on companies that were American companies that they shouldn't, a very severe tax. And yeah, I guess they could remove it. They will, but it doesn't matter to me. We have all the cards. We have all the cards. You know, we do a lot of business with Canada, but relatively little. They do most of their businesses with us.
US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the administration may launch an investigation into the tax, which could lead to retaliatory tariffs worth around $2 billion. The Canadian government has stated it remains willing to continue negotiations.
No, look, we'll continue to conduct these complex negotiations in the best interests of Canadians. It's a negotiation.
According to US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Washington is currently engaged in trade talks with 18 countries and aims to conclude deals with at least 10 to 12 of them by September 1st. The US is also actively negotiating with the European Union, India and Japan. Bessent added that the US and China have expanded an agreement on the supply of rare earth elements, and exports of these critical materials are expected to resume.
After months of tension and stalled negotiations, the US and China have taken a major step toward easing their trade dispute. The two sides have finalised a framework agreement that touches on critical issues like tariffs, rare earth exports and visa restrictions.
China on Friday confirmed the details of a framework to implement the Geneva trade talks consensus with the US, following President Donald Trump's announcement that a new trade agreement had been signed earlier this week. The Chinese Commerce Ministry stated it would approve export applications for controlled items in line with regulations, while Washington agreed to cancel a series of restrictive measures. Though Trump gave few specifics, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said the deal was signed and sealed, with both sides agreeing to expedite rare earth mineral shipments to the US. These critical materials are essential for sectors like electric vehicles, semiconductors and defense, and have been a focal point of the negotiations. The US and China have been locked in a trade conflict since 2018, when Washington began imposing steep tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, citing unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft. Beijing responded with its own tariffs and restrictions, sparking a tit-for-tat trade war that disrupted global markets and strained bilateral ties. Talks in Geneva in May and follow-ups in London laid the groundwork for this week's agreement, which aims to ease tensions after years of friction. While China has accelerated approvals of some rare earth exports, it continues to vet buyers to prevent diversion to military use, contributing to delays. In return, the US has agreed to roll back certain punitive tariffs and pause visa restrictions for Chinese students. However, some measures, particularly imports and duties on steel and aluminum, remain in place.
Vietnam's top garment exporters, many with workforces made up mostly of women, are hoping trade talks with the United States don't derail its business. One major suing company based in Ho Chi Minh City says it's taking steps to protect itself as global trade tensions rise.
Inside this bustling factory in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, women make up the majority of the workforce, powering one of Southeast Asia's biggest garment exporters. Tyson SP exports clothing for brands across Europe, Australia, Canada, and crucially the United States. Last year, Vietnam's textile exports to the US reached $16.6 billion, making it the country's largest market. But that could be under threat. As the Trump administration reopens trade talks with the country, the company fears that new tariffs could disrupt a fragile supply chain. To stay ahead, Tyson is diversifying, attending fashion expos and seeking clients in China, Kazakhstan and the Middle East. For now, production lines keep moving, but for companies like this one, the outcome of negotiations could shape the future of thousands of workers.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is set to begin a week-long diplomatic mission across Europe, with stops in Brussels, Berlin and Paris. The visit comes just ahead of the China-EU Leaders Summit in Beijing next month and is aimed at easing trade tensions and strengthening ties with key European powers. Mahnur Maktoum has more from Beijing.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is expected to embark on a week-long journey to Brussels, Germany and France starting June 30th in a strategic diplomatic push ahead of the upcoming China-EU Leaders Summit in Beijing in July. In Brussels, Wang Yi will lead the 13th round of China-EU high-level dialogue along with the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Belgian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. The talks will address the ongoing trade friction, geopolitical situation and future cooperation. He will then head to Germany, where he will co-chair the China-Germany high-level dialogue on diplomacy and security, amid the growing debate in Berlin over reducing economic reliance on China. His next stop will be Paris, where he will lead the China-France high-level dialogue on people-to-people exchanges, reflecting China's soft power agenda. These visits reflect China's efforts to stabilize relations with the major EU powers, especially as the economic and geopolitical climate continues to intensify. Mahnur Maktoum, A News, Beijing.
Ukrainian officials report that 2 people were killed and 14 injured early Saturday morning after a Russian strike hit a residential building in the city of Odessa. According to Odessa Mayor Hennady Truhanov's Telegram channel, rescuers found the bodies of a couple who died when a drone struck their apartment. At least 14 other civilians were injured, including 3 children. Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities have intensified dramatically in May and June. Lithuania has officially withdrawn from the Ottawa Convention, citing growing security risks from Russia. The decision follows a small move by Poland this week and signals a shift in defence strategies among NATO and EU members. As tensions rise in Eastern Europe, the future of the treaty, which bans anti-personnel landmines, is now in question.
Lithuania has formally withdrawn from the Ottawa Convention, citing rising security risks from Russia. The decision was made official on Friday, with Lithuania notifying the United Nations that it will no longer be bound by the international treaty banning anti-personnel landmines. The withdrawal will take effect in 6 months. Lithuania's move follows similar steps by neighbouring Poland, which also announced its departure from the treaty this week. Both countries, alongside Latvia, Estonia and Finland, all NATO and EU members have raised concerns about the growing military threats posed by Russia, particularly as tensions escalate in Eastern Europe. The Ottawa Convention, formerly known as the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, was adopted in 1997 and came into force in 1999. It prohibits the use, production and stockpiling of anti-personnel landmines and aims to eliminate these weapons globally. More than 160 countries have signed the treaty, committing to destroy existing landmine stockpiles. However, major military powers like Russia, the United States, China, India, and Pakistan have not joined the agreement, leaving a gap in global compliance. The recent withdrawals by Lithuania and Poland signal a critical shift in the future of the Ottawa Convention. As these countries adapt their defense strategies in response to increasing security threats, the effectiveness of the treaty in addressing modern military challenges is now in question. With several NATO and EU members reconsidering their commitment, the Convention faces growing pressure to evolve in line with current geopolitical realities.
President Donald Trump has predicted a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas could be reached within a week. Speaking at an event on Friday, Trump stated that discussions are ongoing to end the conflict in Gaza. Hamas has offered to release remaining hostages, but Israel insists on disarming the group. Trump's comments come after recent US and Israeli airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, and a ceasefire between Israel and Iran went into effect earlier this week. Israeli officials are set to visit Washington next week to discuss Gaza, Iran and peace prospects. And to the Middle East now. In his latest message, Israel's Prime Minister says his country's military victory over Iran has created new opportunities for peace in the region. Our Trent Murray has more from Tel Aviv.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has hinted that his government may be working on some sort of ceasefire agreement within Gaza, as well as an expansion of the Abraham Accords, effectively normalising relations with further Arab countries. In a short but carefully worded video online, the Prime Minister said that Israel fought with strength against Iran and achieved a great victory. And he has gone on to say that that victory opens up an opportunity for a dramatic expansion of peace agreements. He says that he is working vigorously on that. He goes on to say that along with the release of Israeli hostages and the defeat of Hamas, there is a window of opportunity here that must not be wasted. Now, the timing of this statement is interesting because it comes following media reports suggesting that the Trump administration has been pushing for an end to the war in Gaza as part of an overall plan for the day after the war, one in which Israel maybe will see the expansion of the Abraham Accords. The Prime Minister's office has denied some of those reports in the past few hours, but certainly the rhetoric and the language there we are seeing is that diplomatic conversations are indeed taking place. Earlier in the week, President Trump, speaking in The Hague during the NATO summit, said that he believes that a deal in Gaza is getting very close and that great progress is being made. Similar sentiments from Hamas, who in an interview with the BBC earlier this week said that it is engaged in intensive contacts aimed at reaching a ceasefire agreement. But they did add that they have not received any new proposals so far. This comes, of course, after Egypt and Qatar-mediated efforts stalled back in May amid disagreements over the terms of a deal. But it seems the rhetoric both here in Tel Aviv and also across the region suggests that after 630 days of war, diplomatic efforts are indeed being made once again to try and bring an end to the conflict between Hamas and Israel. Trent Murray for A News, Tel Aviv.
Meanwhile, Iran says no meeting with the US is planned, contradicting President Trump's claim that talks were set for next week. Our Turaj Shirelilu has more from Tehran.
3 days after a ceasefire between Iran on one side and the US and Israel on the other, Ayatollah Khamenei congratulated Iranians for defeating Israel and for the heavy slap to the US, warning that Iran would strike back if it is attacked. In a televised address, he also said Iran would not surrender over its nuclear program, despite Trump's call. Also, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, in an interview on state TV, denied an upcoming meeting between Iranian and US negotiators next week, as stated by President Trump. Tehran and Washington were scheduled to hold their sixth round of nuclear negotiations, mediated by Oman, but it was disrupted by Israel and US attacking Iran's nuclear sites. According to Iran's top diplomat, Israel ruined the talks with the US, and the US ruined the talks with the EU, further complicating the settlement of Iran's nuclear issue. He added that Iran would apply for recognition of Israel and the US as the aggressors and will demand compensation from aggressors after damage assessment is completed. He also said that Iran and the European troika of Germany, France, and the UK are considering a new round of the talks on the 2015 nuclear agreement, also known as the JCPOA. Turachi Alilu, reporting for A News TV, Tehran.
In our last episode of Inside Politics talk show, our very own Anastasia Lavina discussed the dangers of Iran's threat to close the Strait of Hormuz with Felipe Fernandez, a political scientist from Matosinhos, Portugal. Felipe explained that if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, the US and Israel are likely to launch an attack on Iran.
For instance, we know that a full blockade would surely provoke US military retaliation, especially if at this given moment Iran would use some of its proxies in the region. We know, for instance, that the Houthis could play a role in the blockade, and if so, then it would lead for sure for a US and possibly even Israeli military retaliation. We know that maintaining a blockade is a very, very intense challenge that maybe Iran could not be even thinking of doing, for instance, due to the US and US allied naval forces present in the region, that they could most likely, with some, neutralize Iranian forces rather quickly. And so this long-term closure could be militarily unsustainable for Iran. Now, on the other hand, this could be also a way of engaging more diplomatically when it comes to the US, especially if we are looking for a partly and temporary blockade, or even if, for all it's worth, the Supreme National Security Council of Iran could refuse this endorsement from the parliament, and so the U.S. would have more than sufficient reasons to go into the negotiation table without having military intervention, and even so, because the U.S. presented to the Western Hemisphere, if we want, their military intervention in Iran at Iranian nuclear facilities as a major success. So it would be rather difficult to easily justify another military intervention within this framework if Iran does not use any of its proxies, or if Iran does not go with a full blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
The US Supreme Court has delivered a major legal victory to Donald Trump, limiting the power of federal judges to issue nationwide injunctions against executive actions. Trump celebrated the 6-3 decision as a giant win on his social media platform. The case stemmed from his attempt to end birthright citizenship, but focused on judicial authority rather than the policy itself. Liberal justices dissented, warning the ruling weakens judicial checks on the presidency. The decision is expected to make it easier for future administrations to implement controversial policies. Now, following the US Supreme Court's ruling to curb lower courts' authority to block executive orders, President Donald Trump hailed what he called a monumental victory for the Constitution, the separation of powers and the rule of law. Joining us now to discuss the implications is Klaus Jurgens, a political analyst from Economy First Limited, London. Welcome to the programme, Klaus.
Thank you, Dilek. Thanks for having me. Hello.
Now, what are your key takeaways from the Supreme Court's decision?
I have to be very brief because I would have quite a bandwagon full of points. Now, first of all, if I may, let us go back to the ruling. 6 rather conservative judges versus 3 liberals. This, of course, goes back with replacing retiring judges years ago. So yes, it was basically a home game for Donald Trump. Second point, the decision of the Supreme Court is still not entirely clear. There is still a certain leeway that it might actually completely revert its cases. Now, if I felt, sorry, looking away from the camera for a second, nationwide injunctions likely exceed the equitable authority that Congress has given to federal courts. Now, this is like a bubblegum judgment, is it not? Likely exceed. And let us remember that only 28 states might be impacted after the 30-day leeway period, grace period, because 22 states actually applied and said, no, we don't want to comply with this. So it's a very complicated legal situation. But yes, it is a temporary huge win for President Trump. Second point, what worries me a little bit is if an elected president of the United States starts by running his country via executive orders only, hoping that all the judges in all the 50 states actually fully comply, and not accepting that one state, 15 or perhaps 22 indeed, might not. What about the judicial democracy? Should there not be a constant checks and balances? So yes, I admit, a huge win for Donald Trump temporarily, but we must make sure that the checks and balances system in the US stays fully in place.
Okay. And now the ruling goes far beyond Trump's citizenship-related executive order, potentially emboldening future presidents to pursue similarly wide-ranging policies. Does this amount to a strengthening of effective governance?
Well, this is, thank you, Dilling. This is exactly, if I may say so, exactly what I wanted to hint at in my second comment, yes. I'm worried about that a huge, diverse country like the United States of America, attracting people from all walks of life, from all four corners of the world, all of a sudden would say, we are no longer accepting the birthright as such. But some commentators, I checked this morning in Europe, got this one wrong as well. He is not saying the birthright by definition to become a US national has been withdrawn. He is saying undocumented mothers in particular, or where if there are two parents, hopefully at least one of them has to be a lawfully residing citizen in the US. Now, I would call this, honestly, discrimination. This is targeting migration background families in particular and their children. Look, my generation, we grew up in Germany, and of course the United States were always a kind of hotspot. Let's go there on holidays, perhaps study one day and then come back. But we would not have necessarily said, okay, someone is 6 months pregnant and risks it and travels to the United States of America, only that her child would actually become a US citizen. What worries me is that people in dire need, in dire straits, coming to the US for a number of reasons, perhaps fleeing their countries, fleeing persecution, or just being migrants, looking for a better way of life, that they might be denied their right if they have children, and hopefully they will. We need young children, that they would be denied the right, actually, that they would become US citizens. That's what really worries me, Dilek.
Okay. Klaus, thank you so much for your insight. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Azerbaijan's foreign ministry has expressed grave concern over recent attacks on Azerbaijanis in Russia's Yekaterinburg. On the 27th of June, Russian Federal Security Service raids on Azerbaijani homes resulted in multiple deaths, injuries, and the detention of 9 individuals. The ministry has called for an urgent investigation by Russian authorities and demands justice for those responsible for this violence. Azerbaijan and China have signed new agreements to boost cooperation in renewable energy and improve Azerbaijan's electricity transmission network. During a visit to Ningbo, Azerbaijani energy minister met with Vice President of China Energy Engineering Corporation to discuss implementing their existing strategic partnership. Talks focused on grid development, joint green energy research, and projects in hydro, solar, and offshore wind power. Additionally, Azerbaijan's Ministry of Energy signed a separate deal with China's Electric Power Planning and Engineering Institute. Azerbaijan and Iran entering a renewed phase of constructive dialogue. With a new ambassador in place and growing political will on both sides, the two countries are signalling a firm commitment to cooperation despite recent regional tensions.
President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev received the credentials of Mojtaba Demircioglu, Iran's newly appointed ambassador to Azerbaijan. During their meeting, both sides emphasized their commitment to deepening bilateral relations based on friendship, mutual respect, and non-interference. President Aliyev recalled his recent phone call with Iran's president and highlighted the positive reception of Iranian presidential candidate Masoud Pezeshkian's visit to Baku, calling it a turning point in bilateral relations. He also condemned false narratives in the media aimed at damaging ties amid recent Iran-Israel tensions, calling such claims baseless. Ambassador Demircioglu reaffirmed Iran's trust that Azerbaijani territory will never be used against Iran and expressed gratitude for Azerbaijan's support during the recent regional crisis. The two sides also discussed future cooperation across multiple sectors, including trade, culture and infrastructure, with particular focus on the North-South Corridor and Araz River Bridge projects.
Senior military leaders from Azerbaijan and Turkey took part in the Distinguished Observer Day of the International Military Exercise Anatolian Eagle 2025, held at the 3rd Main Jet Base in Konya. This year's exercise saw the active participation of 7 countries and NATO, with 5 additional countries attending as observers. Designed to enhance international military cooperation and joint preparedness, the Anatolian Eagle exercise simulates near-real combat scenarios to strengthen coordination among participating forces. Georgia says its strategic ties with the UK are being damaged. Tbilisi has voiced concern over London's recent sanctions and political statements. Georgian Foreign Minister Maka Bochorashvili has criticised the UK's move to impose sanctions on Georgian citizens, saying it undermines the strategic partnership between the two countries. In a meeting with the British ambassador Gareth Ward, Bochorashvili said the sanctions and public remarks from UK officials appear to interfere with Georgia's internal affairs and judicial process. Tbilisi stressed that external pressure should not politicise ongoing legal cases or affect domestic political dynamics. Tensions erupted at the residence of the Catholicos of all Armenians in Echmiadzin after Armenian security forces attempted to detain Archbishop Mikhail Ajapian, head of the Shirak diocese, on charges of publicly calling for the overthrow of the constitutional order. National Security Service officers arrived at the Echmiadzin complex today. Their attempt to detain the Archbishop was met with strong resistance from clergy and faithful of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Ajapian appeared before law enforcement accompanied by his lawyer and Catholicos Garagin II, expressing his readiness to cooperate. However, worshippers blocked the arrest, preventing security forces from taking him into custody. Opposition leader of the Dashnak Tutyun party called on supporters to gather in Echmiadzin to prevent further arrests of clergy. And joining me now is Aydin Nurhan, former ambassador from Ankara. Welcome to the program, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, how significant is this confrontation between the political establishment and the religious one in Armenia? And is there any Russian involvement?
We are in an age of secular states. And but it doesn't end the influence of religion in every country. The United States is affected by that, evangelicals. Israel is a religious state. Iran, Saudi Arabia. So Armenia was supposed to be a secular state, but we understand that they also have a very strong religious vein in the country. We also have the diaspora. So what it means is that manipulated by any authority, they can be instrumental in mingling into politics and try to topple governments. But the most important thing for us is to support Pashinyan against all these troubles. And we see, you just said in your news, Georgia had problems with Britain. So Russia may be manipulating Armenia, which wants to go near the Western powers. So that Turkey is the only opening door for it. So yes, there might be Russian influence in these problems. So what we should do is have a peace as much as possible. The sooner we have it, the better we are, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey.
Okay. And so when you say there may be Russian involvement, Ambassador, are you saying that there might be some influence when the residents of the Catholicos of Armenians were actually, when the conflict erupted there?
You may think of all these kinds of manipulations. Of course, I cannot be sure, but Armenia, just approaching the West, approaching Turkey, approaching peace, would be going away from Russian power in that country. For instance, I just read the problem now, Pashinyan's troubles in wintertime if Russia cuts energy. Imagine the peaceful days between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Azerbaijani oil and gas going into Armenia.
Okay.
One more trouble with Russia will end. They will be free of Russian influence energy-wise. So before also talking to your television, I always stressed this point, that when the peace comes, it will be the best winner, Armenia. Not Turkey, not Azerbaijan, but it will be Armenia. Pashinyan is aware of this. He wants to get rid of Russian influence, European influence, American influence, and act alone, freely, independently, in becoming a member of Caucasus family.
Okay.
So we have to help him. And soon we have to help him. We have no time to lose. Or manipulators will gain time, and we don't know what would happen. Before the elections, he must have this peace, and we have to help him.
Okay, and Ambassador, do you concur with the assertion that it is Pashinyan who has been escalating this confrontation, and it's part of his pre-election efforts to minimize the threat coming from the opponents?
No, I don't believe that.
Okay.
Pashinyan does not become authoritarian. He does not become this and that with all these things. He wants to earn time for peace, and he wants to realize it. Once he does it, look what comes after peace. Energy lines, highways, transit routes. Let me tell you, as I said before, in 3 years, Armenia would rocket up, its economy especially. So what he wants to do is peace and good days for his nation. And any manipulations, any troubles he meets, of course he has to crack down. Or otherwise, these manipulations by foreign powers, using the church, using the diaspora, this and that, then of course he cannot go far away, he may be toppled, and he has to be very alert to all those things. I can understand him. I understand what he does. But let me tell Azerbaijan, which is my home country, I was Consul General in Nakhchivan a long time ago. It's my motherland, same thing. We have to help Pashinyan. Azerbaijan has to help Pashinyan, and very, very quickly we have to make peace.
Okay. Ambassador Aydin, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure talking to you today.
My pleasure. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Now, Afghanistan is feeling the economic shockwaves of the Iran-Israel conflict with a new World Food Programme report warning of rising food and fuel costs. Disruptions to trade through Iran are hitting household budgets hard, especially in urban and low-income areas. Tamim Bahis has more from Kabul.
Afghanistan's markets are feeling the ripple effects of escalating tensions in the Middle East. A new report from the World Food Programme reveals that the recent Iran-Israel conflict is having a direct impact on Afghan trade and household expenses. According to the WFP, imports through Iran have slowed significantly, affecting the flow of essential goods into Afghanistan. As a result, the prices of key staples like flour, rice, and cooking oil have spiked across the country. Diesel prices have risen sharply, now reaching 68.6 Afghanis per litre, a 15% jump compared to the same period last year. These increases are putting additional strain on everyday consumers, especially in urban and low-income areas. The report also sheds light on the country's struggling labour market. On average, Afghan labourers are finding work only about 2 days a week, earning just over 300 Afghanis per day, far from enough to cope with rising living costs. There is, however, a silver lining. Thanks to ongoing domestic harvest, vegetable prices have dropped in several regions. Still, the WFP notes that prices vary widely depending on location and accessibility. With regional tensions continuing to disrupt trade, Afghan households are bracing for a difficult summer. The WFP says it will keep monitoring the situation closely. Tamim Bahis reporting for A News in Kabul, Afghanistan.
That's all we have for now from Baku. Stay tuned to A News for more updates and have a great day.